Simplify, simplify, simplify. That's the one big lesson I learned last summer when I took a watercolor painting workshop from my teacher, Eric Wiegard. We spent 4 days painting outside near Eric's studio in Long Beach, Washington. And each day of the workshop, in the morning, Eric would paint a demonstration painting for us of a scene, and then we would all copy. And same thing in the afternoon, and at the end of the day, we had a critique. So it was a great workshop, and I learned a lot. But Eric emphasized how important it is to simplify the scene in front of you. You know, when you look out in nature, there's just a million little details that you want to put in your painting. There's every leaf in the tree, and every twig, and every flower, and every rock. And if you put all those details in, then you overwhelm the eye, and the viewer can't see, the larger picture. So you have to simplify the scene and paint the big shapes. He says 3 shapes: big, medium, and small. 3 values: light, dark, and medium. And 3 areas: the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. So simplify the painting to achieve the 3 objectives that he has: to draw the eye to the painting from a distance, to carry the eye throughout the painting, and to bring the eye to the center of interest. Simplify. That's the key to making a good painting. Well, in the gospel story today, Jesus is doing something like that. The Pharisees gather around Jesus, and one of them, a lawyer, asks a question: "Teacher, which is the greatest of all the commandments?" Well, it's a pretty good question. At the time of Jesus, there were all these laws and rules to follow, so many commandments that it wasn't really easy to tell which one would apply. And one of the teachers of that time said there were 613 laws in the law and the prophets to follow. There were the 10 Commandments, of course, as well as all the statutes and the ordinances that Moses gave, as well as a whole raft of customs and traditions and taboos and prohibitions. And the prophets, of course, critique the people in keeping the laws. And so with so many laws and so many rules, how do you decide which one applies? Is it more important to keep the Sabbath absolutely strictly? Or is it more important to help your aging mother and father on the Sabbath? Is it more important to offer a lamb to the priest for sacrifice? Or is it more important to give a lamb to a poor family who's hungry? It's hard to tell. So what Jesus does is he simplifies the whole set of codes and laws. He says there's only 2 things. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. If you take all the law and all the prophets and you condense them down into a simple rule, it comes down to those 2 things. Love God, love neighbor. Now, in Jesus' time, there were 2 main sources of ethical instruction. One was the law, which the Torah, the first 5 books of what we know as the Bible. And the other was the prophets. We have a section in the Bible of the major prophets and the minor prophets. And Jesus took all the teachings of the law and the prophets and summarized them in these 2 simple guidelines. Love God and love your neighbor. Of course, those 2 things are already in the Old Testament, but he drew them out and chose those 2. So instead of 613 laws and rules to try to remember, now it's simple, only 2. So if you ever wonder what you're supposed to do, you can ask one simple question. Does this help me love God and love my neighbor? or not? Let love be your guide. Instead of trying to control every action of a person's life with rules, this lets every person decide for themselves what the loving thing is to do. It's simple, it's practical. You know, one of the criticisms of organized religion is that religion tries to control people with this rigid set of rules and legalistic documents and expectations. You've got to dress a certain way, you've got to have a certain lifestyle, you've got to shun people who are different. Jesus doesn't do that. He just says, let love be your guide. I think that's a pretty good guide. I mean, for one thing, it allows people to choose for themselves. You know, let your conscience be your guide. It's up to every individual to decide. And for another thing, it realizes that every circumstance is different. You can't have a law for every single set of circumstances. You need a more general guideline. That's what Jesus gives. Love God and love your neighbor. I mean, it sounds like two laws, but in reality, it's just one. I mean, you can't love God and hate your neighbor. And if you love your neighbor, you're already putting into action, into practice, the love of God. So if you wanted to summarize the Christian religion, if you want to put it in a nutshell, this is it. Love God and love your neighbor. Someone once asked the Dalai Lama to describe his religion. And the Dalai Lama is a Buddhist, and he could have tried to explain the Dharma, all these complex set of practices and beliefs that the Buddhist people have. But he didn't do that. He said, my religion is kindness. So simple. I think if every religious person just focused on being kind, I think we would solve a lot of the world's problems. Be kind. Instead of arguing about religious belief or religious practice, we should just look for the kind thing to do, the loving thing to do. Does this help us love God and love our neighbor? When there are conflicting choices to make the choice of love. Love God and love neighbor. It's so much simpler. When our older son was in high school, he had a friend named Paul. Paul was the youngest son in a family of 6. And after he graduated from high school, Paul went to a trade school to learn computer programming. And after he'd been there a year or so, he came out to his friends as a gay man. And his family knew about it, but they didn't talk about it because it was a difficult subject in that family. His dad, Ron, was a logger. And Ron had spent 25 years as a tree faller. And, you know, he was a typical hard-working, hard-drinking logger. When he came back from Vietnam, he just went and lived in this little shack and almost drank himself to death. Finally, Kathy came and sort of rescued him and brought him back into society, and they got married and had this family. But Ron, he was a conservative guy. That's kind of who he was. Well, it was almost Thanksgiving, and the family always gathered for this big Thanksgiving meal. Everybody was supposed to come. And this year, they weren't sure whether Paul was going to be welcomed at Thanksgiving dinner. So about a week before Thanksgiving, they were all gathered in the living room, and someone said, is Paul going to be welcomed at Thanksgiving this year? And then all the eyes turned to Ron, the father, the patriarch. And he looked around the room and he said, he's my son, and I love him. He's always welcome in my home. And that settled it. When Ron spoke, it was all right after that. Ron chose love. He chose love over what he could have chosen. All the way he'd been brought up, the things he had heard, and things his friend expressed, he chose the love of his son instead. You know, the world is complex. Our lives are complex. There's so many decisions to make. But when it comes right down to it, the great commandment of Jesus is simple. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself.